The subject we were discussing today was about the search for meaning and how this fits into the practice of Dhamma. Before I go any further, just as a little introduction, I will tell a story of Mullah Nasruddin, who is a quite famous character in Persian folklore, who there are many, many stories written about him. And each story that is written about him has some kind of symbolic meaning or a moral that some wisdom inside it. But they tend to be quite amusing stories too. So this one is one of the most famous ones. So in this story, it is late evening and almost completely dark in the street, and two men are walking along the street, and just as they pass by a street lamp, they see that there is a man on his knees under the street lamp searching all around there. And as they look a little bit closer, one of them recognizes the person, and he sees that it's Mullah Nasruddin. And so he asks him, "Oh, sir, what are you doing here? What have you lost? Have you lost something?" And the mullah looks up and he says, "Yes, I have lost my keys. I can't find them." And so, wishing to be helpful, the other man replies and asks him, "Oh, do you remember where you found them last, or where you last had them?" And he replies, Yes, I remember exactly. I lost them. I was just over in those bushes over there." He points to maybe a place a few meters away. "I was over there in those bushes and I dropped the keys and I lost them there." And so now the two men look at each other and they're very puzzled. And they ask him, "But sir, if you lost them over there, why are you searching here?" And he replies, "Because here I have light. It's so much easier." So I'll come back to this story in a little bit and explain what the meaning of it is in relation to this subject. But first I want to talk a little bit about the search for meaning as a human being. So we start from this point. As a human being, as human beings, we all look for meaning in our lives. If our life has no meaning, if it's totally pointless, then yes, exactly that. What is the point of living? We can't bear it. We need to have some kind of meaning in our lives. By which I mean, we need our lives to count for something, to have some value, some higher worth, higher than just being a biological entity that lives and dies, that eats when he's hungry, sleeps when he's tired, is driven by biological urges to reproduce himself until he dies. It seems that most people, at least the vast majority, cannot bear the idea that this is all there is to their life. Of course, there are a few people who are atheists and who believe that really this is all that we are. We are biological entities and nothing more. But there are relatively few. And before I go any further, I should also point out that the belief that we are nothing more than biological entities and there is no higher worth to our lives than that, it is just that, it's a belief, as much as a belief in God or a belief in samsara, the cycle of birth and death, or as much as any belief. Because you can't prove that there is nothing more, that we can't know or that we can't see. So you have to believe in the idea of atheism, that there is no before, there is no after, as much as you have to believe in any religion. And it's a belief that the majority of people shy away from, even if religion is becoming less and less a powerful force, or people do not necessarily follow a religion. At least in Europe and North America, people are not necessarily atheists. Rather, if they don't follow a traditional religion of Christianity or Judaism or Islam, people tend to be agnostic, in the sense that they acknowledge they have this doubt. Okay, I don't know if there's a God, but maybe there is one. I believe that there is something, but perhaps there is nothing. People prefer to have this doubt than to declare that nothing exists beyond what science shows us, and that we are just biological entities. So the interesting question that we can ask here is, how come we need a belief in a higher power or a divine being or divine force of some kind in order that our life should have meaning? How come we don't find it in our lives as it is? What is it that makes our life to be meaningless as it is, as we see it, as we live it? People tend to see the difference between life having meaning or having no meaning in terms of the existence of a God or no. In the sense that God sort of symbolizes, now I'm not necessarily talking about specifically the Christian God or the God of Abraham or any particular God, but a God, a divine force, a divine being. He is the symbol or representative of whatever makes us more than biological entities, if this exists. So when we search for meaning in the life, it tends to end up being translated into a search of God, or a search of some divine power, or a soul, or something divine inside every one of us, or however we may describe it. And I believe this is also partly the reason that some people are turned away by Buddhism, because it doesn't offer them any of this. It doesn't offer a higher power or a higher being or a soul or any of those things that they search for when they look for meaning in the life. Instead, it is basically what Buddhism tells us is that when we search for meaning in this way, we are a bit like Mullah Nasruddin searching for his keys under the street lamp, where his keys aren't to be found because he didn't lose them there, instead of searching them in the bushes, which is in the dark, and it's more difficult to search there, but that's where he lost them and that's where the keys are. Because if we ask ourselves this question, if we live our lives in exactly the same way, but we believe in God, does this automatically make our lives more meaningful? If we live in a way that is meaningless, investing ourselves in things that are of no worth, and we don't change anything in ourselves and we change nothing, then believing in God doesn't give any more meaning to our lives. And that's because the existence or the lack of God in our lives is not what makes our lives meaningless. What makes our lives meaningless is that we live them in a way that is meaningless. So the correct place to search for meaning is to actually look at what is it about our lives that makes them meaningless, that makes them essentially without any true worth or any value. Because the problem with living your life as if you were basically a biological entity and it's just enjoy what you can enjoy until you die is that you're building a life based on things and depending on things that all change, that are all just there for a while and they die, just like you, just like everything. What the Buddha saw and what the wisdom that he found was this, that whatever changes, whatever is subject to decay and to death, is ultimately of no worth, of no value. So if we continue to depend on these things, to live in dependence on these things, to build a life around all these things that change and that decay and that die, and then we search for meaning in our lives while still continuing to live the same way, but it's exactly like being Mullah Nasruddin searching under the street lamp. We want to stay in the place that's comfortable for us and with what we know, with what we're used to, which means to depend on all these things that change and that die, to be attached to them, to love them, to find our source of pleasure and enjoyment from them. So we want to stay in this comfort zone and search for wisdom, search for truth, and search for meaning. And yet it is exactly because we live our lives depending on these things and acting out of our craving for these things that die and that change and out of attachment for them, it's exactly because of this that our lives are meaningless and that they have no true worth. So people try to impart a higher meaning to their lives or a greater sense of worth to their lives by sort of changing or at least adding one object that seems a little bit higher or a little bit better on which they can depend. As in, instead of just depending on money or depending on food, I will depend on God. I will live because of God, instead of just living because of food or living because of money or living because of enjoyment. But instead of changing this object for which you are searching for and on which you depend, the Buddha taught that we have to start with ourselves. Find yourself, find wisdom, find what is true, see things as they really are. The one who finds truth and finds himself, this is the one who has the highest value in this universe, is a higher value than the highest God and the highest heaven. He is the one who has conquered good and evil, not by conquering an outside force of evil or by winning some battle in the world, but he has won the battle over himself, over all of the evil forces that exist within himself. So what Buddhism says is something quite incredible, that this is possible. It's possible to win over everything that is wrong or every malignant thing inside you. It's possible to destroy them and to get rid of them for good. And this, as a human being in this human form, by our own responsibility and by our own actions, we have the potential to do this. So Buddhism is far from saying that there is no meaning to our lives or no meaning to our existence, but rather what it says is that our worth and our value and the meaning of our lives does not come down to whether we believe or not in some kind of higher power or higher form, or whether that exists or not. It's entirely our responsibility. It's entirely our own actions, our own choices that determine the value of our lives and the meaning of our lives.